Chapter 33. Remnant. Instead of a hospital bed, Gideon found himself waking up in the bed he first called his own. He rarely used it, so it never really needed to be replaced, despite the fact it was several decades old. Memories past of sleepless nights and loneliness that now paled in comparison to the soul ache he now bore. He was alone. The voices in his head affirmed that and amplified the accompanying emotions tenfold now that he had no strength or will to ignore or counter them. They railed over and over again as he lived and relived what passed through him the moment the witch took his hand. He had failed. The blade was right. Every single mission, every single assignment, every single expectation made of him as the only thing that could possibly distract from a reality too cruel to bear the weight of minds willing to consider anything deeper than surface level. The voices echoed at the corner of his consciousness, like hearing speech in a dream that you just woke up from. He looked around the room and perspective turned to despair. He saw a roof over his head, their shelter only delayed atrophy. He saw Havaliah's notes on their dresser. Their studies only distracted from an existence that bears as much meaning to the ignorant as the informed. He saw Olivia and Daniel's beds at each corner of the room. The trust demonstrated by their integrity and respect for one another was meaningless if not defined by an objective source. He couldn't see anything in this world for the rest of his life as anything more than a curse. All but one thing. He saw the sword in his hand. Havaliah, Daniel, and Olivia all stood alongside Dr. Nebo as the instructor wrote his report aloud for them all to hear, waiting for any notes of correction as he went along. To the head of Beacon Academy and chief executor of the Huntsmen, greetings. I regret to inform you that the mission you designated to Team Gold was a failure. The witch was able to counter the semblance of Huntsman Gideon Azariah with means unknown to all, including him. The grim weapon proved ineffective, and further attempts on her territory need to be considered approaching with other than conventional arms. Shady Academy expects no counter-offensive, but will continue to keep you appraised of future candidates that may bear the potential of ending the greatest threat to all four kingdoms. We thank you for helping us rebuild during this time of peace, and will continue the initiative of fictional foundations for the curriculum of our school. Sincerely, Huntsman Ashpenez Nebo, head of Shade Academy. He set down his pen and waited for Olivia to stop giggling at his birth name. Havaliah tilted her head towards Dr. Nebo. You have the same name? Dr. Nebo nodded. Adopted son, in fact. The paperwork for charity was easier back then, he said with a smile as the instructor let out a dry laugh from his nose. We had better send this off. Dismissed. They all made their way down the hall to check on Gideon. Olivia was still giggling, and this made any purposeful stride difficult to maintain. Daniel gave her a cursory hug and made his way to Havaliah's side as they recalled all they had seen and been through as they passed through these halls. No words were exchanged at first. They simply moved with quiet gratitude through the air-conditioned halls as the heat of summer shimmered mirages outside the windows of their school and dormitorium. Havaliah was the first one to speak. So, have the two of you started making arrangements? Daniel raised an eyebrow. For what? Havaliah shrugged. I wasn't planning on chaperoning your honeymoon. I was just thinking that time would be best spent on your own. So I'll ask, should I find some new place to live, or will you? Olivia jumped in between them and made an exaggerated pose to block them from moving forward as she entered the realm of visibility. Yo, I heard you were talking about my man, and you thought I wouldn't hear about it? Havaliah began play-slapping to get her to stop. You know I can't stand that, forcefully enunciating every word to make the point as lightheartedly as possible. Daniel moved his arm to take the blows for her and began waving his hands. All right, we can quote the things you torture us with on your scroll's new features later. Havaliah made a cursory gesture and shook her head. I still don't know why he thought it was a good idea to let you test out the upgrades he makes for these things before sending them back to Atlas. Olivia stuck out her tongue and took Daniel's hand. We'll discuss all that later. He made a gesture to Havaliah. Well, Leia, since you didn't get the chance during the mission, I think you can ask him now. She smiled and moved to open the door to the room they had shared since they were children. She opened it slowly to take in the early morning sunrise from the windows and looked forward to a nice vacation after the week they'd all had. She allowed herself the time to take in all she could for this moment. The beds all moved at different corners, the places they studied together and apart, the little additions made here and there that made it seem more homely, even at the cost of being practical. Though she admitted the blue curtains were her idea. It reminded her of water, she said. They had laughed. Yet it was always something that brought tears to her eyes, even as a little girl. She could even hear the sound of it now. A steady drip, drip, drip echoed from the edge of her hearing that took her back to the days when she had been so afraid. She tried to act so strong, yet Gideon had shown her where she had yet to grow. He was the headwater that kept her going. And while she did fancy hopes of relationships in the future, right now she just wanted to be there for her dearest, quiet, and gentle friend. Get. Her words were cut off when a single step revealed the source of the noise. A small pool had gathered next to Gideon's bed that was slowly making its way to the door. Her eyes followed the stream unconsciously to find that Gideon's hands were both hanging off the edge of the bed. She absently examined his right hand with an empty laugh, wondering why he didn't let go of his sword if he could the entire time. Where was his sword? She examined around the bed and found it embedded and protruding from his abdomen. A distant scream could be heard, and she saw a figure move over to Gideon's bed that she couldn't make out right away. Daniel? She was slurring her words. For some reason, she couldn't call to mind what that meant. Dehydration, maybe? There was so much water all over the floor that she couldn't imagine why. The big person she realized was Daniel began looking around and over the body while wrapping sheets around Gideon's waist and chest. What's wrong? She asked the open air as another person ran over and grabbed her. She felt wet on her shoulder and slowly began to realize it was Olivia. Her knees were shaking, so she decided to let them fall. So much water. She began to lightly splash at the dark liquid gathering around and matting her skin. 2 more individuals ran into the room, and she noticed right away one was the instructor. She still didn't understand what was going on. Shh. Guys, Gideon is resting. Her shoulder got even more wet, and the room got even more loud. But it was all faded to her for another several moments before the blood rushed back to her head. Blood. That was what was all over the floor and now on her hands. Daniel stepped back shaking as the instructor and Nevo began attempting field surgery like they had taught her to do all those years ago. Gideon was lying on the bed and his skin was beginning to turn dark. She wondered if she was still in shock as she recalled accidents and injuries around the city she had seen made people turn lighter. She looked over to Daniel, who watched in horror as his friend turned to ashes, along with his blade, as the slightest puff echoed through Havaliah's ears, watching it land on the mattress before turning to nothing before them all. The instructor slowly made his way to Daniel, trying to explain what he saw, and her ears continued to ring as Olivia's distant bawling echoed throughout the room. Nebo stood hopelessly before Gideon's now empty bed. Daniel and Olivia vented their emotions in their own ways at this sight. But what chilled Havaliah to the core wasn't what she recalled as her system trying to increase her blood flow in response to experiencing trauma. She was shaken by the image that stood before her. A pool of her best friend's lifeblood ran across the floor, and nothing in her mind gave her reason to see any difference between it and the life-giving stream she saw in this God-forsaken world. Epilogue. The instructor returned to his office after washing the blood from his hands. His clothes, however, were still soaked, and he knew he needed to change right away. The image still haunted him, but the message needed to be communicated as soon as possible. Though Nebo would recommend his scroll, this information couldn't be exposed to the public. Not anymore, anyway. He lamented at that precaution becoming a necessity and moved to pick up his pen. More for his own sake than any need for clarity, he read out the last addition to the report. Postscript. The grim doppelganger is slain. Though the bandit Abimelech's character was the template, his good nature served as the opposite of the blood he was copied from in every way. Caution is advised in the future for any good-natured individuals taken captive by the enemy, as this would likely work both ways. I'd like to request a formal burial and to designate him KIA. All eyewitnesses were huntsmen and can be trusted. He set down the pen and saw his hand shaking. Whether it was grief, remorse, or simply fatigue, he did not know. All he knew for now, as well as the days to come, was to make sure the rest of their world could stay the same. With a snort of disgust, he took the letter and disposed of it. He would have to get into this habit. He moved to dial on his scroll and figured he'd just make something up. Ozpin didn't need to know the whole story. His soul was heavy enough as it is.